His men both loved and feared him. Born in New York to Italian parents in 1914, Paul Vario, or Paulie, as his friends called him, would one day become one of the most powerful capos in the Lucchese crime family. His base of operation was Brownsville, an area of Brooklyn which became notorious during the 1940s as the headquarters for dozens of contract killers who became known to the public as Murder Incorporated. Vario was considered extremely quiet and rarely spoke about his family or his childhood. What we know about him today comes from two sources: his arrest record and that he was the head of the crew, which included two well-known associates, Jimmy the Gent Burke and Henry Hill. In fact, Vario would never have been known outside of law enforcement circles had it not been for the book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi and the subsequent 1990 Hollywood blockbuster film Goodfellas. Vario was a large man, standing over 6 feet tall and tipping the scales at nearly 250 pounds. Henry Hill explained, "Paulie was impervious to fear, impossible to surprise. If a car backfired or someone called his name, Paul Vario's head would turn, but slowly." It has been reported that Paulie first got involved in organized crime in the mid-1920s. From then on, until his death, he earned a reputation for ruthlessness due to the fact that he held loyalty above all things and dealt swiftly and harshly with those who betrayed him. His first arrest was around the year 1925, at the tender age of 11, when he was convicted of truancy and served 7 months in a juvenile detention center. Over the next 60-plus years, Vario would rack up more arrests and a few convictions for various crimes including loan sharking, burglary, tax evasion, bribery, bookmaking, contempt of court, and assault. A 1988 article in the New York Times by Mark Hulig states that Vario was also arrested on rape charges. It should be noted that the article never mentioned who the victim was or if Vario was ever convicted. Besides being the boss of his own crew, Paulie also owns several legitimate businesses, including a flower shop, a cab stand, the Euclid Avenue Cab Company, and a restaurant, Presto Pizzeria. Though also mobbed up, his brothers, Vito, Salvatore, Thomas, and Leonard, ran most of his legitimate businesses. The aforementioned Leonard, who was the oldest of the Vario children, had the distinction of once having been arrested with Charles Lucky Luciano. Vito, a younger sibling, who was also known as Tutty, ran the pizzeria and the cab stand, where most of the crew's illegal business was conducted. The cab stand stood directly across the street from the home occupied by the teenage Henry Hill. As a young man, Hill would run errands, park cars, and do other various odd jobs for the Vario crew. Though no documentation exists as to the exact date Paulie became associated with the Lucchese's, it appears that sometime in the 1950s he was initiated into the family and became a made man, and was probably elevated to capo sometime in the 1960s. Various reports state that for a brief time, Vario held the position of acting underboss for Stefano LaSalle just prior to the conviction of then mob boss Carmine Mr. Gibbs Tramunti. However, these reports are sometimes debated. What isn't debated is the fact that Vario's crew was said to be one of the most lucrative in the Lucchese Borgata, with the bulk of their illegal income coming from hijacking trucks leaving JFK Airport. Henry Hill noted, "To us, and especially to guys like Jimmy, the airport was better than Citibank. If the crew needed cash, they would simply go down to JFK and make a withdrawal." During the 1980s crackdown on the mob and the subsequent commission trials, the FBI would listen in with hidden microphones as Lucchese family members and associates boasted, "We own JFK," an obvious testament to the power and influence Vario exerted at the airport and his control over the cargo haulers union. It was further reported that Vario and his crew owned any and all gambling operations in the East New York section of Brooklyn, with Vario personally receiving a percentage of the earnings estimated to be in the thousands of dollars per day. Vario, taking a page out of the older gangster handbook, was low profile. He wasn't flashy and he didn't like attention, especially from law enforcement. He rarely spoke on the phone, instead giving orders in person to a selected few underlings to carry out or deliver his edicts. Henry Hill explained, "Paulie ran the whole thing in his head. He didn't take notes. He never wrote anything down, and he never made a phone call unless it was from a booth. And then he'd only make an appointment for later." In fact, Vario was so low profile that this speaker can attest that the numerous encyclopedias he owns still do not contain an entry for Paul Vario. In the 1970s, Paulie briefly served as the membership director for Joe Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League, but stepped down when Colombo began picketing the FBI office in New York. Paulie was sure that this was not a good move by Colombo and that it would cause unwanted attention on their illegal activities. But by this time, it was too late. The FBI now had Vario on their radar and began tracking his every move. As a result of their surveillance, Vario was indicted, and though offered immunity, he refused to cooperate. After being found guilty of contempt, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He did his time with Henry Hill, who was serving a 10-year prison sentence for an attempted murder conviction. A year after his conviction, Paulie was paroled and began having an affair with Hill's wife. One insider noted he was banging her every chance he got. When Tommy DeSimone wanted some of the same action, his attempt at seduction quickly failed, so he tried to strong-arm rape Karen Hill. When Vario found out, he was furious, and he called the Gambino family and told them DeSimone was not a made man and was responsible for killing 2 of their men, one of which may have been Billy Batts, as portrayed in Goodfellas. Later, Hill would report that it was John Gotti himself who killed DeSimone in retaliation for the murder of Batts. Though not directly involved with the heist at Lufthansa Airport, as capo, Vario would have had to approve Burke's plan for the robbery. Again, according to Hill, Vario received a large payoff as a result of the heist. In 1980, Henry Hill flipped and became a government witness. This may have been payback for the affair Vario had with Hill's wife, or it may have been that he feared Burke and Vario would whack him for drug dealing without permission. But according to Hill, he seemed to believe that it was due to his involvement with the Lufthansa heist. Hill knew that Burke had already whacked out several others involved in the theft, and he feared that he was next. Whatever the reason, as a result of Hill's testimony, Vario was found guilty in 1984 for defrauding the government. A few years later, he was sentenced to 6 years for extortion, largely based on Hill's testimony. As the prison gates closed behind him, one can't help but wonder if Paul Vario knew he would never see the outside world again. He was in his 70s and in poor health. He died on May 3, 1988, at the age of 73 from respiratory illness. Paul Vario's last residence was the Fort Worth Federal Prison in Texas. His body was buried at St. John's Cemetery, Middle Village, Queens, New York. Many believe that with the passing of Vario, the last of the old mafiosos died with him.